on that subject, for our last question of the day, I actually wanted to open this discussion a little bit broader, and focus on what you were talking about earlier, which is eugenics, which is, again, the practice of breeding out people with inferior genetics while you uplift and try to support those who have what you believe to be superior genetics. Unfortunately, like Carl Linnaeus, capitalism and white supremacy, eugenics has also stood the test of time. Even though the eugenics conferences and organizations that sprang up in the early 1900s are no longer active, that doesn't necessarily mean that eugenics isn't being implemented today. And you were sort of talking a little bit about that, especially when it came to coronavirus. But nowadays, again, eugenics can be seen everywhere, from our environment and how we deal with public health to technology. But it's also done or it can be done in a very discreet way, where a lot of people don't recognize at first that, oh, this is in line with eugenics. As a specialist in this field, where else do you see eugenics manifesting? And how can regular folks like myself or our audience members be more aware, or maybe even to take action?
So this is a tough one, and a controversial one. um, but, there have been discussions that eugenics exists today in terms of genetic testing, right? That's one of the ways, because genetic testing, right, it's not really that we all have different DNAs. This is why we couldn't be separated as different species, right? We're the same species and we have the same DNA. But a lot of the DNA testing, right? Even if you take a test with one company versus another, you'll get different results. And the reason for that is because, there are lots of reasons for that, but one of the main reasons goes back to the data input, right? And the data collected. And so one of the main ways that these companies are going around, and they are mostly private companies at this point, are going around and gathering data in an unregulated way, is that, or I shouldn't say, some parts of it are unregulated. And so they go to different areas and they see, and this makes sense, right? They see what's common, right? What are the common traits to this country? What are the common traits to that country, right? Because genetics aren't drawn by country lines, right? Those are made by the countries, not by our DNA. And so to be able to say that people have this certain DNA, it's because they went and they gathered certain traits. But how are they choosing those traits? What are they looking for, right? There are all sorts of questions that go into that further. And then things like Indigenous folks here, right? There are lots of folks and lots of Indigenous tribes that, were redrawn in the 1700s and the 1800s. Their names were completely changed. There was genocide, right? So how are they going to get that DNA? So, there are lots of folks that have this family knowledge of being Indigenous, but they can't really talk to that. They can't see that on the DNA. That's more complicated because there's also blood quantum with being Indigenous. And actually, maybe this is kind of a little bit of an offshoot to your question, right? Blood quantum is how native you are, right? And so the idea is, and for African Americans, it used to be one drop of blood. So there was blood quantum for Native Americans, and the more Native American you were, the more rights you had to your land. The less Native you became, the more you were going to give up your sovereignty. And so, by the time a grandchild or great grandchild came along, maybe the sovereignty is gone and they don't claim being native anymore, right? And so then you have on the opposite side, you have one drop of blood, and that is for African Americans. And the more African American the less, it doesn't matter how African American you are, if there's one drop, you're considered African American by law, right? This was long time ago. It's changed since, but blood quantum still exists. But both of these things were economically driven, right? And this is the thing about eugenics. This is the thing about science and race, is that there's usually economics attached, right? So the more African American you were, the more policies there were that kept you marginalized. The less Native American you were, the more you landed into the general American population and lost your rights to sovereignty, right? And so again, you're losing resources. And so both of these were just different sides of the same coin. And so you still see some of that today because there still is blood quantum, right? And you still see things like, you still see in the DNA testing, right? You see these kind of ideas that differ in terms of what makes a person, from this specific country from that country, right? And that's determined by private corporations right now. So, I mean, there are lots of different ways that I think we could look into it. There are some folks that talk about medical genetics, and Genome Project didn't have people of color for a while. And so, someone might be able to argue that was a form of eugenics as well. I will say the Genome Project has been kind of bringing in more like phenotypes, more different types of people. And so that's really a benefit. And so I do think that fortunately today, a lot of people are trying to kind of be aware of this, and there are more voices involved and there are more policies involved. But you're right, it's still there. It's still there. And we see it in reproductive health too, right? Right now it's rearing its head in reproductive health. So, yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioning the DNA tests. Gosh, I mean, I ended up taking one. My mother-in-law was like, "Hey, here's a test to learn about your background." I was like, "Okay, cool." And I remember it being so like, "Oh my gosh, the answers!" And I know that a lot of people, take this so much to heart, where they're like, "I got my DNA test. I'm gonna go move to to see my people," and then they go there like, "Oh, they treat me like an American." But I'm really glad that you sort of tie this together in terms of what we do with the data, and whether you spit into a cup and people try to tell you that you're one race, or whether the data is talking about trends within the workplace. I'm really glad that you were sort of able to talk about how diversity, equity, inclusion are apply to all these things.